Hello and welcome to a special edition of the Hammer Time podcast. On Friday, I recorded a conversation with Neil Oliver for GB Originals, and I think it would be a shame not to show it to you. I think it turned out quite well. We talked about many of the ongoing geopolitical developments, what's going on internationally, but of course also what's going on politically within the United Kingdom, which was really a broad issue. I'm sure you all have followed the recent developments with Keir Starmer apparently at least pretending to be more strict on immigration. Apparently, instead of 500,000 new migrants per year, it's only, between scary quotes, going to be 300,000 migrants per year. I think Alison Pearson wrote in the Telegraph that this is one of the biggest shams she's ever seen. So I'm afraid that she's right, but it remains to be seen. At least, as the optimist would say, they are starting to pay lip service to the problem at hand. At worst, of course, there's always the risk that it's going to be too late. The world is changing quite rapidly. You're all familiar with Lenin's famous quote that there are decades in which nothing happens, and then there are weeks in which decades happen. I think we're in precisely such a situation. I talked about all of this with Neil. I hope you enjoy it. And as always, please, leave a like, subscribe, leave a comment. I'm always happy to hear from you. I'm planning to do a live stream very, very soon so that we can actually interact in person, that I can answer your questions, listen to your critique. As always, I'm not here to indoctrinate. I share my views, I share my opinions, but of course, I'm curious what you guys think. I have no monopoly, unfortunately, on wisdom and on knowledge and on many areas. I know that many of you are probably better educated than I am, so I'm happy to hear from you. Let's have this conversation. There's so much going on. I think in order to be prepared for the changes that are coming, these conversations about the real issues, the deep topics, are more needed than ever. And I hope that this conversation with Neil Oliver will serve a little bit as food for thought and a cause for reflection. And let's talk soon.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining me yet again on GBN Originals. My guest for a conversation today is Ralph Scholhammer, Professor of International Relations and a good friend of mine over the years, and I find him to be an insightful observer and commentator on all manner of geopolitical issues of the day. Good to see you again, Ralph.
Thanks for having me, Neil. It's fantastic to be back on. There's so much to talk about.
I know it's every day. I think when we're waking up and look out of the window, so to speak, it's a smorgasbord of issues and concerns and fascinations. Something that attracted my attention this week, I'm sure I'm not alone, what's unfolding between India and Pakistan in the aftermath of the terrorist attack. Where mostly Hindus, tourists were killed, but also some Muslims, I believe one Christian, if not more. I wonder, Ralph, what you make of this latest trouble in an area that, of course, has never been far from trouble really during our lifetimes. There's always been tension there. Do you think we're looking at another false flag, or how do you interpret what's happened most recently?
Well, I think there is this old quote by Lenin where he says that sometimes there are decades where nothing happens, and then there are weeks where decades happen. And I think this is very much the time we are in right now. I know this sounds like a trope, but I cannot remember any period in my lifetime where, just as you said, I'm a fellow podcaster like you, and we are now in this position when you record a podcast on Monday and say, I'll put it online on Wednesday or Thursday. You can no longer do this because what you said or whichever guest you had on Monday probably is already outdated by Wednesday or by Thursday. So this is, one can really feel the tremendous changes that are going on, the tectonic plates that are shifting. Now, regarding the India-Pakistan conflict, so there are, I think, two things to keep in mind. One is I am very surprised by the not media silence, but I would almost call it the lack of interest in a potential escalating conflict between two nuclear powers. Whether it's on social media, whether it's the general headlines, it pops up on occasion because they have to report it, but there is no in-depth engagement with it. And this is very frightening, I would say, what's going on there. Most people say, oh, no, don't worry about it. The cool heads will prevail. And at the end of the day, both in Pakistan and India, rational people are calling the shots. Maybe, but very often those are the same people who told us that a Russian invasion of Ukraine is never going to happen. Now, I'm not trying to scare anybody here and say, oh, this is the end is nigh and the world is going to end. But what we can tell is that over the last couple of months, we have edged ever closer to potential scenarios that could spiral into a conflagration that potentially would include nuclear weapons in a way that simply was not even thinkable in the 1990s and in the early 2000s. So I'm in no position, and I would never claim that I am, to predict what is going to happen, but that the potential scenarios and the level of risk that is present have significantly increased over the last 4 or 5 years. I think nobody can deny this. So we cling to this almost 1990s way to look at the world, that at the end of the day, everything is going to be fine. And I'm sure that on the long run, things will be fine. I'm still an optimist when it comes to the long arch of history. But in the short-term future, I think there are many things to be worried about. And I'm just very concerned, something, Neil, that we have talked about so often. Do we have the right people in charge in Europe, in the United States, almost everywhere, to deal with these tremendous challenges?
It's interesting you make that point. I sometimes, or I increasingly look on at, let's say, the Prime Minister of the UK, Keir Starmer. I look at other figures across Europe, and increasingly it seems to me we're almost dealing with individuals who function as rubber gloves worn on the hands of others while they handle things that are, unthinkably dirty. They're almost just using these people that we can see, and that it becomes increasingly hard to imagine that the people that we see, even Donald Trump, but certainly the figures across Europe, the figures in the EU, the British Prime Minister, it becomes increasingly hard to imagine that they are actually the people making the decisions. And you mentioned also a kind of perfunctory reporting on the trouble between India and Pakistan at the moment, I listened to, on the other hand, George Galloway, who's been involved in that part of the world for decades. He's been decorated with civilian decorations by Pakistan on not one but two occasions, and he's declared that he has skin in the game. And he noted, and I thought it was important, that the group that has claimed responsibility for the atrocity, he's never heard of. And as he said, if he's never heard of this group, then that's suspicious. And I wonder at the extent to which you think that what's happening there is organically happening between Pakistan and India and the regimes thereof, or whether we're looking at another proxy situation where other players are just using a flashpoint location to keep everyone in the world on the edge of their seats.
Well, I think it's a good question, and let me try to give a nuanced answer, if I may, which is usually we try to distinguish whether something is truly a grassroots movement or whether it's astroturfed, but I could imagine that there is something in between. And what I mean by this, is it possible that there was outside interference for whatever reason to escalate this conflict? Yes. Is it, however, also possible that there were groups within Pakistan, within the territory of Pakistan, that were, so to speak, just waiting for somebody to support them to such an extent that they can do what they did? I think that is also possible, right? What I mean by this, I give you an example. There can be no doubt, which was a huge mistake. You had people on your show, and I fully agree with them, that the United States in the Syrian civil war more than once supported the wrong side, right? They even now, I'm sure that your viewers have saw now the leader of Syria, a former head of chopper, now visiting France, right? Just because he's wearing a tie, he's apparently a completely new person. But it's also not entirely wrong that there were periods in time where ISIS or ISIS-affiliated groups were supported by the United States. But were they created by the United States? And I think this is a distinction we also have to make. So does this mean that there is no animosity between Pakistan and India, and this is entirely created from the outside? Or is it that maybe an outside force, and we can talk in greater detail who that could be, took advantage of something that was already there? And I think that's the most honest way to approach this, because otherwise we fall into this trap that we think that everything that happens in the world is entirely due to one group of potentially very sinister people, which I'm not denying that they exist. But of course, very often they are smart enough to tap into something that already exists. I mean, we can talk about this in greater detail. I've been making the same argument, for example, about the World Economic Forum on Davos for a very long time, that they tapped, for example, into this existential angst in the West and then filled it with things like net zero and the climate scare. So, but if they wouldn't have been there, or let's put it differently, if this existential dread or that anxiety would not have been there in Western societies to begin with, they could have never taken advantage of this. So what I'm trying to say is there need to be two to tango, so to speak. There is one side, again, as I said, I have no sympathy for those people, but they just take advantage of something that does exist. They're not entirely responsible for creating it. And I think that's a similar thing that you see happening potentially in India and Pakistan and in other places around the world as well. I mean, there is very often the argument being made, which I'm again not hostile to, that there has been a period in the past where, for example, Israel was accepting or even encouraging payments from Qatar to Hamas. Now, does that, however, mean that the conflict between Palestinians and Israel, or between radical Islam and Israel, was created by Israel? Or was it just that they, for whatever reasons we can go into greater detail, on occasion were funding those who are actually their enemies? And I think these things are not mutually exclusive. So there can be an existing condition that is then either expanded or limited by an outside force. And I think that's a more nuanced a way to look at this than to just say, okay, there's everything that happens is because there is one group of people and they perfectly execute a strategy and there is no deviation from it. And even more importantly, that nobody else has any agency. That worries me the most. So, I mean, India is still a sovereign nation. So even if somebody was conducting this as a false flag operation, again, which cannot be entirely ruled out because I don't know it and nobody of the commentators knows it either. But that doesn't mean that India wouldn't have agency, right? They could find that out as well. They could look at this as well. And I think this is something that we have to keep an eye on too.
It seems to me it's very interesting. And I wonder if it's another of those unintended consequences that we often find ourselves confronting, that the recent activity by the action being prosecuted by Israel in Gaza, you know, that wholesale slaughter that's going on that now seems to be metamorphosing into starvation, deliberately applied starvation. Nonetheless, that action there, prolonged as it is, made people like me and many others pay attention really for the first time to notions like the Nakba and the Deir Yassin massacre, or all the way back to the foundation of Israel in 1948, which had almost drifted from most people's memories if they had ever been aware of it. And suddenly many people were looking back at the history there in an attempt to better understand what was going on. And likewise, events in Syria did something similar. I found myself, you know, having to go to the books and trying to place what was happening into a deeper context, because that was something that in recent years I've learned I have to do. Now with India and Pakistan, you know, I'm looking back to partition in 48 and the fact, you know, the fact that Kashmir was guaranteed self-determination of one sort or another all the way back then. And that was then ratified or reiterated by the United Nations in the early 50s, that the people living there would always have the opportunity and the right to choose who they lived with, and who they chose as their allies or whatever else. I wonder if it's an unintended consequence that so many of us are beginning to piece together, as best we can, the enormous jigsaw of so much that's going. Things that used to happen in isolation are now falling into place for many of us.
Well, I think one problem is that, and this makes these conflicts also so difficult to discuss in any setting, is that for not everybody, for the largest part in the West, we have become post-historic societies. I think this is changing a little bit. We can talk about this as well, especially among the younger generation, the under 30 years old. But let's say your generation, my generation, we have become a more, which is not entirely a bad thing, but we have become a somewhat postmodern, post-historic, some would even say a post-heroic generation, if you want. Whereas in other parts of the world, like in India and Pakistan, like in the Middle East and other places as well, even history that is 80 years in the past is still very present. And this is something we have, I believe, a harder time to grasp in Europe in particular, which is, think about it. The conflict, or the root cause, if you want, or one of the root causes, there's never a monocausal explanation of what you just mentioned with the establishment, whether it was India and Pakistan or Israel in 1948. That's about, with the difference of 3 years, as long in the past as the end of World War II. But for them, the 40s appear to be much more present as a cause for current action than it is in Europe today. It's still a little, again, it's still there a little bit, but a young person nowadays, I would argue at least, or somebody like you and I, there is the occasional reference to World War II, and we all immediately, compare everything and everybody to Hitler. So that's still there. But nobody necessarily has any, it's again slightly different with some countries, but there is no discussion, let's say, about Germany demanding back its eastern territories, or the Poles demanding back their former western territories, or that we have to renegotiate. Again, there are some people that say this, you find it on social media, but there's no general sentiment in that direction. The other thing is that you and I, the British and the Germans, which I think is a great accomplishment, we get along, I would say, very well. I hope at least, I'm a pleasantly enough and well enough received guest on British media, and nobody says, oh my God, that must be the grandson of a former Nazi. So how can we talk to that person? So for us, we remember history, we are aware of it, but it does not have as much of a bearing on contemporary political events as it does in those areas. On the one hand, I admire this because I think history is important. You and I think agree on this, that tradition, kind of looking back and knowing the things that happened before, is very crucial. But on the other hand, it is also a mortgage. It's also a particular burden, because if the crimes of the past are so vivid in the way you educate your children, in the collective memory, then whether you want to call it forgiveness or a lasting peace, whatever term you then want to use, becomes so much more difficult to accomplish. It is, as I said, we tend to forget this, but the fact that Russians, Brits, Germans, and French people can interact, can engage on almost completely equal terms, that's quite the accomplishment, given what these people have done to each other in the 40s.
Yes, it's absolutely not about the necessity to harbour grudges. I'm not meaning that the pains of the parents and the grandparents should be inherited and prosecuted and perpetuated by the children and the grandchildren. However, there's no denying the importance of context, and I think more and more of us are finding that it's not the news as we're presented it by the mainstream. It treats us as though nothing happened yesterday, and that the only thing to which a person ought to pay attention is what's happening today. Don't bother trying to contextualise it, and I think that's been pushed too far. So it's not that I'm saying that when you think about the Middle East, that you take on the bitter grudges that have been harboured there and perpetuate them. And looking at Syria, it's not about looking for grudges that can be pushed on, or in India and Pakistan. But nonetheless, I wonder if it was an unintended consequence of the Machiavellian figures that move pieces around on the board, that they have inspired in so many people a need to understand, not necessarily to judge, far less to inherit bitterness, but just to understand. And that where so many people are finding their way to understanding, it makes it difficult for those moving the pieces on the board to pretend as if they can operate, with impunity.
No, I think that's very true. But I think you're absolutely right. But one of the first steps that I believe is also psychologically the most healthy one is to find out, as you just described, where on the board are we? And to be even more frank here, are we a piece on the board, or are we one of the players? I think this is always the first question you have to ask. And I'm not just speaking about you and I as individuals, but let's say the UK, Austria, Germany, the EU, the United States. I don't care, like you name it. If you look at these different quote-unquote players, who is actually a player and who is actually quote-unquote just a piece on the board? But I think that's the first thing you have to distinguish, because those who are the players have the most agency, and those who are the pieces on the board have little to no agency. So I think that's the first thing that one has to take a look at. Then the second thing, of course, is from what perspective are we interested in this? And I don't want to get too philosophical, but I think it is important, because I believe that's also what many of your viewers and my viewers feel when we talk about these things. Are we just kind of commentators who talk about the broad happenings in the world? Or are we interested in talking about what's happening in the world from a distinctively, since this is on GB News, a distinctively British perspective? And while we can discuss in passing, let's say, the more universal moral implications, we're of course also interested in what would be the best path forward for the United Kingdom. What does it mean for the people of Britain? Which action, what kind of actions would impact the British people in which way? And I think this is something very often these days, at least that's my sense, and please feel free to disagree, that very often we have this team mentality. So like you have this India-Pakistan thing blowing up, and immediately you have some of the most listened to or consumed commentators taking sides, right? Not all of them, and then you immediately move to, you put a small Indian flag in your social media profile, or you put a small Pakistani flag in your social media. I find that you can do this, I have no problem with it, but my point is always, first of all, the only flag, if I would be British, would be a British flag that I would put in my profile. That's number one. And then I would look at this conflict and say, first of all, every conflict is tragic, right? Because when innocent people die, it's never good. I think nobody says, oh yes, that's awesome. But the second thing is, okay, what does this mean? What does this changing geopolitical regional landscape mean for Britain? And how can we, A, protect the British people as best as we can from whatever negative fallout there is? And B, I know this sounds very cruel, very Machiavellian also on my part, but also which, for lack of a better term, because English is not my native language, what opportunities could potentially arise, or which, long-term constructive approach could Britain take? I think these are the conversations we are almost entirely missing from, not on your show, of course, but in its entirety. We do still this very 1990 thing, and I do it too, where we look at the world as this almost, an out-of-body experience. We look at the world, we do it, I think, very well, and I hope the reviewers we see it the same way. But we act as if we are not also in some way affected by it, and I think that's a conversation we also need to have, also in the interest of the people, because at the end, this is going to have an effect on them in some way, or maybe it doesn't have an effect on them. But I think this is something that in the mainstream media is not discussed enough.
You've really touched on something for me there when you talk about the way in which people are and ought to be interested in how it affects their own country. The British people ought to pay attention to what it means to them. German people should pay attention to what it means to Germany, and so on and so on. I do, and when I say you've touched on something, it seems to me increasingly that there are two worlds living side by side. One of them is the world of populations who do care. People in Britain care about what happens to Britain. People in Austria care about what happens to Austria. People in the US care about what happens in the US. They want peace, broadly speaking. They want what people always want. They want safety for their families. They want opportunities for their families. They want to be able to go to work. They want to see their children educated. And these are all natural human desires. But the other world that's existing simultaneously is the world of the powerful. And I think it feels increasingly that someone who's nominally in charge of Britain demonstrably doesn't care about Britain. And people that are in charge of nations across Europe demonstrably don't care about the wants and needs of their populations and the wants and needs of those countries, because they're involved in this bigger game of power where populations are just incidental and collateral damage in the face of this increasingly desperate, I would say, attempt to maintain a status quo that keeps the powerful and wealthy, and devil take the hindmost for everybody else.
No, well, I think you're almost too polite and too soft-spoken on this issue. I would go a step further and say that it's not that they don't care. I think in many cases, they're openly opposed to their own people. I'm always reminded, I know this is years in the past, I'm sure you remember it, when Gordon Brown was caught with a hot mic, and he was... when he talked to some elderly lady about the problems of what we would call the common people, and then when they drove away and his mic was still on, he said, "Oh, this person was absolutely dreadful and how horrible." And this is what they think of us, if I might say so, right? This is Keir Starmer is not if you want a neutral arbiter in these things. I would argue, if I look at what happened in the UK over the last couple of years, and not as bad as the Tories, or worse than the Tories, but the Tories, I would say, fall in a similar category. In many areas, these are policies that are pursued actively against the interest of the British people. Or I think the problem, you described it quite nicely, Neil, they don't even have a conceptualization of what the British people actually are. This is why we have these, to be honest, completely absurd, although very important, discussions about migration. Everybody in Britain knows intuitively what it means to be British, but those who are in charge of Britain apparently have no idea. And one of the things that came to mind during the V-Day and the celebrations and all of this was that very often there is a lamentation by the media and by politicians that there is such a small number that's willing to die for their country. But I think the tragedy is not that there are so few people that want to die for the country. The tragedy is there are so few countries that are worth dying for. And I think that is truly one of the major lessons. Whatever one thinks about World War I and World War II, and God help us all that these things never happen again. I think we all agree on that. But the reason why we call them the greatest generation in the United States, but I think similarly over here as well, is because we know that they have accomplished something that we probably could no longer do. And this, as I said, the kind of test that those two wars were was the most horrible test you can imagine. But I would say overall, they passed it. And to be very clear here, this is a controversial thing I'm saying, but I say it nonetheless. I would include in this, of course, the German and the Russian soldiers as well. They might serve in the name of an evil regime. I'm the last one to deny this. And this is a direct quote from the late French president François Mitterrand. I mean, one cannot deny that when their fatherland called upon them, right, when the storm was blowing, if you want, and they were called upon to march, they marched. I have a certain sense of admiration for that. Again, I said, I hope I never have to trade places with them. I hope I'm never in that kind of situation. But that was a generation that after 1945 rebuilt continental Europe, that rebuilt Great Britain, that sent somebody to the moon in the 1960s. So there was something different. And this is not just, to be very clear, this is not just nostalgia. Because people say, oh, this is just the old nostalgia and everything was better in the past. I'm not saying that everything was better in the past, but I think the social capital, the quality of the people, if you want, was different. As I said, I don't want to go back. I don't want to trade places with them. But there is nothing wrong with admitting, or at least entertaining the thought, that maybe the generations that came before us, first of all, still have something to teach us, and maybe in some areas that matter, were superior to us or to how we are today. That might sound very provocative, and I'm happy to admit if I should be wrong, but that's at least the feeling that I'm having.
You're quite right, though, when you say that are there countries worth dying for. We are reaping the whirlwind. We are harvesting the bitter crop that's been sown, inasmuch as there have been generations who've been progressively taught that their countries are shameful and that the pasts of their countries are shameful. And then all of a sudden, the latest, youngest generation are expected to contemplate fighting and dying for something they have been taught is indefensible. It's a strange paradox that the youngest generations have been offered. And I think that's why we have an existential crisis, because it has been deliberately made a world in which we've been taught that countries don't matter. Other things matter, such that you can't then try to replay the greatest hits and say now is the time to be patriotic. Patriotic about what? When you've told me I'm the inheritor of a shameful colonialist, imperialist past, and now you want me to contemplate shedding blood to defend that flag. It doesn't make sense. It's not joined up thinking, is it?
Yeah, but it's even, I think you're absolutely right, but it's even worse than that. Because the idea of the, as you described it so accurately, of the status quo elite is not even that you die for your flag, it's pretty much that you die for somebody else's flag. Now, as I said, I have my own idiosyncratic views on all the conflicts currently in the world, but one thing I believe that you and all your viewers agree on is whenever a British soldier is called upon to potentially kill in the name of his country and die for his country, that it should be for his country. So this idea that it should be for anybody, like whether it's, I don't care if it's India, Ukraine or Israel, you name it, I honestly don't care. The point is, unless you can make a very strong and convincing case why this is in the interest, as we said before, of the British people, unless you can make that case, to be quite frank, I don't really care. And this is the problem we have today. So first, as you said, you reprogram, and I think that is an accurate term here, an entire generation in abandoning their traditions, in abandoning their civilizations, in abandoning all the values that kept them together, that made them part of quote-unquote British society. And then you think you can just switch a flip or flip a switch and have this back on, and then almost target it at the one specific thing you want to aim it at. So you want to convince British people to say it is absolutely crucial that Ukraine remains Ukrainian, that whatever other conflict in whatever country you want to take. But if anybody in Britain then raises his hand and says, well, I would really like for Britain to remain British, then you're labeled a racist, a Nazi, a fascist, and in the worst case, you're thrown in prison, or at least you get a visit by the police. And this is something that most people in Britain do not understand, and they are right not to understand it. Because it is, first of all, it's so deeply un-British. And you said something else, Neil, that's very, very important. I was on your show 2 years ago, and said that because that had really good, lots of people watched it, so it's worthwhile, remembering every one of it. Well, we discussed whether or not Europe, including the UK, is in a pre-revolutionary phase, and I think yes, we still are. And what you described before is the key thing here. We are currently in an institutional crisis, and every revolution begins with a crisis, right? The French Revolution began with a financial crisis, so to speak. The American Revolution began with a taxation crisis. The Russian Revolution began with the crisis triggered both by World War I and also the Russian-Japanese War and all these things. So 1948, right, the revolutions began with the impact of industrialization. So every revolution had an institutional crisis before. The question is which countries will be able to adapt to this crisis and which countries won't. And the reason why I'm saying this is, whatever Donald Trump does, and I don't want to switch the topic, but I think that's important to say, he tries to answer to the crisis. I think Donald Trump, he would never admit it, that maybe he doesn't understand it, cognitively, but intuitively. He's a symptom of that crisis. This is the thing, like, we would never have gotten Trump if there wouldn't have been a crisis before. And that crisis is still going on. And I believe the United States, with their trade policy, with bringing back manufacturing, and I don't know if it's going to work, but at least they tried, with strengthening the working class again. That's how they try to address the crisis and thereby also save the existing institutions. Can you save the existing institutions in Germany? Can you save the existing institutions in the UK? When more and more people start to think, justifiably so in many cases, that these very institutions are being abused by the status quo elites to diminish, blackmail, and destroy the opposition. Because once people think that it's not just the parties, Labour, the German conservatives, you name them, are operating against the people, if they think the very system is operating against the people, their revolution will not just be aimed at Keir Starmer or Rishi Sunak or Kemi Badenoch, whoever it is. Their revolution will be targeting the entire system in itself. And that is much, much more dangerous and much more worrisome than anything else. But unfortunately, as you said so eloquently, Neil, they don't get it. They think all of this is just a protest vote. Oh, people vote for reform. They vote for Nigel Farage. Oh, this is going to blow over. We just have to, eyes closed, finger in your ears, and then we just power through. And then people will say, we tried it and it didn't work out. And let's go back to the Tories. Let's go back to Labour. Let's go back to the Social Democrats. This is not going to happen. We are, as you said, we are in the pre-revolutionary phase where people increasingly feel that their vote, their voice no longer matters. And at some point, they will use alternative ways of making their feelings, their justified feelings, and their desires recognizable. And that can be a very, very unpretty picture. And again, I'm not wishing for it. I'm just saying that at some point, this is the only chance you have if you feel that everything is going to the wrong direction and no legal path towards affecting change is open for you. You have at some point to take the illegal path. Again, I'm not encouraging it. I'm not wishing for it, but I'm predicting that this potential will happen. And this is something I talked with you about, what, for example, David Betts, right, of King's College in London, is talking about when he says we are on the brink of civil unrest because unrest is the only alternative if you can no longer affect change in a peaceful way. Honestly, it all makes complete sense. I'm very surprised how patient. Maybe that's because the average age is now no longer in their 20s, but in the 40s. I'm surprised by the patience that the people of Britain and continental Europe have shown over the last couple of years. But I think patience is running very thin.
The instability that you're describing, I think, is also spreading. It's obviously spreading. And I think it's part and parcel, I think, of that way in which America, the American empire, is coming to the end of its natural life, not least because America isn't adapting to or even accepting the change from a unipolar world to a multipolar world. And it's still operating in large part as though it's still 1991. But you and I have talked about AfD in Germany, you know, the alternative for Germany that has attracted a popular vote and is being increasingly stamped on by the ancient regime. We've talked about the electoral interference in Romania when that was, you know, when a democratic process was stamped upon because it wasn't going the way that the regime wanted, and so on and so on. But what's become very interesting, I would say, in the last couple of weeks is what's happening in Burkina Faso. You know, to move it into a whole other continent. I wonder in Burkina Faso and the way in which Ibrahim Traoré is being described in the mainstream media as a dictator and a thief and all of the rest of it. Are we seeing there a variation on the same theme? That whoever he is, he's offering the people of Burkina Faso something that they evidently want. And because it flies in the face of the status quo, in this case the French regime, that it must be crushed. You know, are we just yet again now in Africa increasingly seeing that people are dissatisfied? They're looking for alternatives. And when they do look for an alternative, the ancient regime steps in to try and delete it before it can get anywhere.
No, I think that assessment is absolutely correct. And it was the Indian foreign minister who said we usually don't like taking advice from people who just preach but don't do anything. And he was particularly talking about the Europeans here, and I think the same is true in Africa. Now, I want to make, if you allow me, I want to make one very quick point about the United States. Everything seems, because the communication is not as good as it could be, very chaotic at the moment. But I think that the Trump administration, for better or worse, has realized that the 1991 unipolar moment is over. And what they're, I mean, this is just my assessment of the situation. So, you know, mine is as good as yours. But I think what they're attempting to do is to build a separate economic sphere encompassing most of the Western Hemisphere. So from the tip of Latin America up to Alaska. That is my speculation. And ironically, when Donald Trump always mocks the European Union, in a sense, I'm exaggerating slightly for dramatic effect, in a sense, he's trying to build something similar with North and South America, an integrated economic space with the United States being the dominant part, but having from agriculture to energy security to a large labor market, everything within its neighborhood, within its vicinity, with Latin America, including Canada as well. And by the way, just one quick word about Canada, because this is something I believe that many commentators have completely missed. Donald Trump, again, very controversial thing I'm saying here, but I believe that Donald Trump wanted Mark Carney to become Canada's new prime minister. If you look at the way he communicated, like for example, when he called Justin Trudeau the governor of the great state of Canada, he never ever called Mark Carney the governor. He always called him prime minister. He said in an interview, he said he wants a liberal in charge in Canada. And I think the reason for this, Trump is sometimes, or his advisors, I don't know, are smarter than one would think. He wants a weak Canadian government. He wants a constitutional crisis in Canada between the province of Alberta and the central government in Ottawa, because that will allow him to unleash the energy reserves in Alberta, because they will have to make a compromise with Alberta, which means that North America, or the Americas, if you want, will get even stronger. So it all seems so mad and chaotic, but there is a signal behind the noise. There is some method to the madness. Now, if all of this is going to play out the way he wants to, I don't know. Is it all going to play out before the midterm elections next year? Probably not. But this goes now to the question you said about Africa, right? If you want to create fundamental change, you have to operate in longer time frames. And that's a little bit the big issue, of course, you have in countries like Africa is, I'm not generally in favor of a dictatorship, but if you want to bring a country forward and have it, quote unquote, jump decades in a very short amount of time, I don't think that the quote unquote, once again, liberal or whatever you will call it, democratic system is the right way to do this. And we had people like Jerry Rawlings in Ghana, who was a dictator, but I think he enacted many reforms and did many things that ultimately brought the country more forward than it brought it backwards. And I think you're absolutely right. I think a similar thing is true in Burkina Faso and other places as well. And the other thing is, this once again sounds very, very mean, but if you operate on, some people might even say that this is racist, and I apologize for that, but there's no other way for me to describe it. If you operate in the political and cultural sphere of Africa, there is a different level of brutality. So you cannot, this is not like elections in Switzerland or something where you can simply assume that you come into power and then your opponent will accept that you won the elections and that he lost the elections, and the bureaucracy and the military all swear an oath on you and the new government that nothing is going to happen. You constantly have to watch your back. The military might make a coup. There might be a separatist province. There might be your competitor who doesn't accept the outcome of the election. So they have to operate in a completely different political environment. And as you say, we are so inclined to project our historical experiences or the system that we are socialized into, that we're comfortable with, onto the rest of the world. And this is why so many things, Afghanistan, Iraq, Yemen, didn't work, because unfortunately you cannot simply create a blueprint of the American Constitution or whichever, of the Swiss Constitution, I don't care, and just go to these places and say, and now I implement the Swedish Constitution in Afghanistan, and 2 years down the road Kabul will look like Stockholm. I mean, in fact, what's happening is that Stockholm starts to look more like Kabul, but that's a separate issue we can talk about. But this is I think many of the things it's so interesting that we constantly talk about the importance of diversity, but very often our commentators, our analysts, our elites are completely incapable of accepting there is indeed a lot of diversity in the world. And if there are different places with different people and cultures, you have to treat them differently. Not because again, this is not a moral judgment. This is not a hierarchy that, oh, these are better, these are worse. This is a simple statement of facts that politics operates differently in sub-Saharan Africa than it does in Scotland. You know what, Scotland, I take Scotland back because I think they are, no offense to Neil, but Scotland might be on the brink of their own version of tribal politics, but this is what you see. And then, oh, by the way, even in these countries, politics will start to operate differently.
Maybe we are, as I listen to you, maybe we are then seeing the American deep state beginning to adjust to a new reality. Obviously BRICS is going its own way. These are in an increasing number of nations that are finding ways to cooperate with one another rather than fight with one another, however much they like or dislike each other at the atomic level. But they're finding ways to cooperate. They're challenging the US hegemony. They're challenging the hegemony of the petrodollar and all of the rest of it. And perhaps that's becoming too big for the US to pretend it doesn't exist. Maybe, as you say, what's happening with this seeming attempt to unite the whole of the Americas into one kind of bloc might also be symptomatic of that. And I also, the way in which Trump has been speaking very recently about Yemen and the Houthi, I wonder if that's facing up to a part of a reality. Because after all, if America and the deep state was to remain predicated on the idea of going to war with Iran next, or even contemplating war with China, it's very hard to remain credible in promoting ideas like that if you are being effectively humiliated by the Houthi of an impoverished country like Yemen. America has not been able to bring, shock and awe to completely obliterate the Houthi in Yemen. It just has not worked. The Houthi have remained able to launch their attacks with impunity, and such that it would appear possible that Trump or the people behind him are just accepting a reality. And likewise, perhaps while America and the deep state remains committed to Israel and Israel first, perhaps the time of the Netanyahu iteration of that regime is being seen to have run its course. Do you see what I mean? Is all of it perhaps indicative of the American deep state adapting to reality, a new reality?
I would agree with everything you say. I would make just one qualifier, which is that maybe gradually the deep state is not there are still those parts, particularly in the judiciary, who try to constrain Trump. But I think at some point what they're doing is, purge is a very strong word, but of course they probably try to replace the previous deep state with their own deep state, which I have no problem with, to be quite honest, because we talked about this on your show in previous times. If you want to have lasting change, you need to change the institutions and the bureaucracy, because otherwise Trump will be, I don't think he's going to run for a third term. We'll see about that. But at the moment, I think it's highly unlikely. And even if he does run for a third term, it's not clear that he would win. So once he's out of office, if he wants to ensure that the new course he has charted, that the United States remain on that course, he has to change, to use the phrase that used, he has to change the deep state. So I think that is true. And I also think it is true that you mentioned Israel, you mentioned the Houthis, is that in this new Trumpian America, the United States will intensify their relations with some places in the world. I think particularly their neighbor to the north and their neighbors to the south, but they will gradually retreat from other places in the world. So I think the so-called Israel first, that is so much on people's minds, that this will become weaker in the future for a very simple reason. Due to the shale revolution and the energy revolution that turned the United States from being an energy importer to being an energy exporter, they no longer need the Middle East, to say it bluntly. I mean, it doesn't, there are always cultural ties, historical ties. I think they will never be entirely disinterested in the region for all kinds of reasons, whether you want to call it then the Israel lobby or, obviously the United States have closer relations with Israel than they do with Palestine for numerous reasons that we can go into. So this will remain. But as you said, the kind of commitment, I believe, will definitely weaken. You see it with the Houthis. The argument is, whether that is entirely true or not, we have to take a closer look. But the argument is that if we can reshape the global economy in a way that whatever goes through the Suez Canal to the Red Sea is only a very limited impact on the US economy, then why should we maintain freedom of the seas? Now, again, if they can really shift everything they need in order to maintain the level of prosperity and wealth the Americans have, and they can do this within the Western Hemisphere, I don't know. That remains to be seen. But I think you're absolutely right. This is a deliberate retreat. And the point about BRICS, I will just say one quick thing, is we once again have to be careful not to project our perception of the world on this, because I do not think, I was listening very closely last year when Russia hosted the BRICS summit. And the one term that Vladimir Putin used more than any other was sovereignty. So most members of the BRICS, I think, perceive BRICS to be not to become something like an opposing force to NATO or like an alternative European Union. I think they perceive it as an alliance, not designed to create a strong alliance, but to create an alliance that strengthens the member states within. So that is jealously guarding the sovereignty of Russia, of Brazil, of China. And just a last point. So some ideas like them having a common currency or a joint military, I don't think that that's going to happen. I don't think that the Russians or vice versa would hand over the monetary policy to Beijing, or that India would hand over, a command over or even partially over their military forces to China, or that they would allow Chinese troops on Indian territory or something. I think that's not going to happen. But what they will do, I agree with you, is that if they feel that there are tendencies from, let's say, the more universalist countries like the pre-Trump America or the European Union, that they propose things that would infringe on their sovereignty, I think then they will form a unified bloc that will jealously guard and defend their member states' sovereignty.
Don't you think that, in a way, potentially makes the BRICS even more challenging to the old world order?
Oh, absolutely.
Precisely because it isn't posturing as some kind of, sub-Warsaw Pact military alternative to NATO, and that they have made it plain that they're looking in an attempt to get away from the petrodollar. There's talk of this kind of gold-backed token that would essentially, they would be trading each sovereign nation in its domestic currency, but with a less than 50% of it backed by gold. But in any event, away from the financial minutiae, they're not talking about threatening or fighting NATO or America. It's worse than that. It's a turning away from the West, from the US. And it's all of these resource-rich, entrepreneurial, forward-looking countries that are simply agreeing to cooperate with one another in quite mercenary ways. Just, you scratch my back economically and I'll scratch yours. And then we don't need America. We don't want American goods. We don't want to trade in the dollar. So rather than another hard force for NATO or the US to bump up against, it's like punching water. Your fist just disappears into it. It's not about a fight.
Yeah, I think that's true. No, I think that's true. The only thing I would add to this is the financial power that to this very day, and I think also into the foreseeable future, still is with the US dollar, I think cannot be underestimated. And what I mean by this is there are more dollar deposits outside of the US than that are within the US. So there are many nations, including members of the BRICS, who have significant debt in dollars to other non-American nations. And as much as they might want to gain independence, let's say, from the American financial system, they still also want that outstanding debt to be served. So the American financial system is, for better or worse, I'm acknowledging, I'm not approving it or promoting it, I'm just acknowledging it, is still tremendously powerful. They lost their credibility, of course, particularly in the way due to the Russia-Ukraine war. But on the other hand, to go back to your argument, if Trump actually pursues this kind of policy where he says, listen, guys, here is this sphere of influence that I've carved out for the United States. This is what we're going to put our focus on. And if on the medium to long term, if China wants to, in whatever, again, I'm being deliberately provocative here, if they want to reunify with Taiwan, and if they do it in, let's say, a non-violent manner, the United States will, they will issue a protest note or something, but they're not going to do anything. If, let's say, the Palestinians want to declare their own state, if the Russians want to annex Crimea and the 4 provinces in eastern Ukraine, if they say, we're not going to be particularly happy, but we're more or less not going to do anything about it, then you could have the potential effect that, as you described, those BRICS members say, whoa, wait a moment. If the Americans take very much a hands-off approach, but the dollar is still working, we kind of can actually stick to the dollar, because the reason why you have this shift against kind of US financial power is because there is this fear that this financial power might be weaponized against them. Now, if Donald Trump says, guys, I just want to make deals, I just want to get along, my focus is on the worker in Detroit and not on whatever's going on in some other place in the world, right? They might say, well, under these circumstances, actually, sticking with the dollar might not be the worst idea. The famous if it ain't broken, why fix it? And I think that could also be like an unforeseen outcome of this, that the more hands-off approach of Trump is actually strengthening the position of their financial market and the dollar, because it's no longer perceived as a threat. I'm not saying that that's going to happen, but we are in such an interesting period right now that, as we said at the beginning of our conversation, we have this conversation, and maybe 3 days from now, the Americans are going to come out with some completely new announcement. And I know that this weekend, until May 10th, that Xi Jinping is going to be in Russia. There will be some announcement, I'm sure, between Moscow and Beijing. We have no idea what it is. Maybe they come out with a new pipeline, a new alliance, a Russian, Chinese, as you said, gold-backed intermediate currency. We have no idea. This is the problem at the moment. Things move so fast. It's almost so everybody who at this point claims that they can tell you what's going to happen in the next couple of years. There are some people whom I trust, but overall, I believe you can't. There's a great book. It's a quick recommendation by Neil Howe. It's called The Fourth Turning. And I don't want to give it all away, but he has a co-author. I forgot the name of the co-author. But they make the argument that every 80 years, there is significant structural change within the global system. And they argue it, and I think that's actually a good argument, because they say after 80 years is when, and now we have 80 years, the end of World War II, is when the generation that consciously experienced a certain point in time and its aftermath, they start to die off. So, the people that really lived through the World War II period are almost gone, more or less. So that memory is gone. So now something new comes up, because these historical experiences have lost their hold, if you want, on the people. I'm simplifying, but it's a great book. I highly recommend it. And they made many predictions. They didn't predict what's going to happen, but they said that in the 2020s, right, this is when we're gonna see fundamental change happening once again. And one has to hand it to them. They were spot on target. And I always say I pick my favorite authors based on the reliability of their predictions, and some of them are very reliable.
I could talk with you all day, Ralph, but one last thing. It's a slight change, but not a complete change. It's still in the context. While I still have you, a new pope, an American pope for the first time in 2,000 years. I wonder what you make of that. I saw an interesting quote by the Reverend James Bretschke, a theology professor at John Carroll University in Ohio, and he said, he wasn't thrilled with the idea of an American pope, and he said, America's image in the world simply is too powerful and, to be blunt, ugly. So I wonder in that context whether you think the advent of an American pope at this time is about unity, or whether it's just further revealing underlying American claims on control on every aspect of life around the world.
I mean, I'm sure it's going to be a boost for American Catholics because now it's quote unquote their pope. But the hopes that at least the believers and the faithful I have in my circle of friends and my social circle, their biggest hope is that the new pope will be more pronounced Catholic than anything else. And that's gonna be the big thing, because we touched on this a little bit, but I sense, particularly among my younger British friends, that there is a trend towards Catholicism and towards a more conservative or traditionalist, I think that's a better term, a more traditionalist version of Catholicism. So if this Pope does not realize that, or is not at least somewhat aware of, that the next generation of Catholics wants a thoroughly Catholic and not postmodern church, I think he's going to be in for a lot of trouble. I mean, with the exception of some parts in Africa and Asia and Latin America, within the West, including the United States, the Catholic Church is bleeding members. And one reason I believe is definitely in Europe, definitely, it might be slightly different in the United States, is because there has been a sense that the Catholic Church itself was no longer sure about its Catholicism. And if he reverses that, good, great for him. I'm Catholic myself. If not, it would be tragic. The Catholic Church has been a continuously existing institution for 2,000 years. I think they have a role to play. I think that we talked about this very often on your show. I think that religion in many shapes and forms is making a comeback. And I'd like to see, a strong, powerful Christian representation in this global resurgence of religion as well.
I think we've covered a lot of ground today.
We did.
Ralph, I'm satisfied with the progress we've made in our ongoing conversation, but we'll do this again soon. Thank you, Professor Ralph Schulhammer, for your time.
Thanks, Neil.